During his 1930s visit to India, the renowned US historian Will Durant observed, "The British conquest of India was the invasion and destruction of a high civilization by a trading company devoid of ethics or principles, which subjugated the country through force and violence." The East India Company conquered not a barren land, but the glittering jewel of the medieval world. India, at the time, was a powerhouse of industry, surpassing any nation in Europe or Asia. It was celebrated globally for its superior textiles, jewelry, pottery, and ironworks. In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%. However, 250 years later, as the British departed, they left behind the most impoverished nation on the planet. India was reeling from centuries of exploitation, its population reduced to illiterate and malnourished peasants on the brink of starvation. How was such a devastating transformation achieved? We are about to delve into one of history's darkest chapters. When the British arrived, India was a paradox of political weakness and economic prosperity. The Mughal dynasty, which had stimulated arts, science, and literature, succumbed to the common fate of monarchies in 1658, with Shah Jahan succeeded by his fanatical son, Aurangzeb. His misgovernance over 5 decades left the empire fragmented upon his death, paving the way for petty princes to establish their rule across numerous sovereign states. Seizing the opportunity presented by the fall of the Mughal Empire and the ensuing power vacuum among warring principalities in the 18th century, the British systematically subjugated vast territories. The East India Company began by renting trading posts in Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, fortifying them with troops and cannons without local permission. They swiftly established themselves as kingmakers by providing European weapons and troops to local rulers in exchange for land, revenue, and taxation rights. European backing could significantly alter the balance of power among rivals. Bengal, in particular, became a revolving door of rulers who paid princely sums to be installed as puppet monarchs. With the installation of each new ruler, the British obtained increasingly lucrative concessions, steadily tightening their grip on the economy. The British also levied fees on the rulers of princely states for their enthronement and defense against adversaries, resembling an imperial form of extortion. Over time, the native rulers of India became completely dependent on the company for everything from defense and administration to tax collection. By ousting nawabs and maharajas, looting their treasuries and depriving farmers of land ownership, the East India Company secured its dominance, eventually overseeing the finances of India's wealthiest provinces. This position of control gave the East India Company the right to tax 20 million people, yielding approximately £315 million annually in today's currency. The immense tax revenue funded further conquests, which in turn brought more tax revenue, creating a vicious cycle resulting in the annexation of province after province. Faced with a choice between continuing a losing war or accepting a pension, the last Mughal emperor ultimately chose the latter. This decision led to him relinquishing control over northeast India and marked the beginning of British rule. India has been conquered multiple times throughout its history. Unlike the Mughal Emperor Babur, who invaded from Central Asia and made India his home, or Nadir Shah, the Persian king who looted and left, the British had a different approach. They viewed India as an inexhaustible gold mine, its resources to be perpetually extracted. The British functioned both as merchant and a sovereign. As the former, it engaged in trade, and as the latter, it appropriated revenue. Their policies resulted in the extraction of resources, the collapse of trade, widespread starvation, and poverty. When there was nothing left to loot, they packed their bags and departed, leaving behind the corpse of India. Taxation became Britain's favored method of extraction, treating India as a cash cow with revenues flowing directly into the London Treasury. Described as a gift from heaven by the Earl of Chatham, over 2 centuries the financial drain amounted to trillions of dollars. The provinces were taxed so heavily that 2/3 of the population fled. Defaulters were confined to cages and exposed to the scorching sun, fathers were driven to sell their children to meet the exorbitant tax rates. In the process of conquering India, the British carried out hundreds of wars, mainly using Indian troops. Millions of Indians shed their blood for India to become a colony. Additionally, the cost of these wars was entirely funded by Indian taxes, allowing the English to boast about conquering India without spending a cent. The profits were so substantial that the British government took control over the East India Company, rewarding the company's shareholders handsomely. The English added the purchase price to India's public debt at 10.5% interest, marking the beginning of a series of costly purchases made at the expense of the national Indian exchequer. Viewing India's markets as outlets for its products and Indian taxpayers' revenue as a limitless fund for the expansion of its empire, British governance proved even more rapacious than the East India Company's rule. Throughout the 19th century, India contributed $450 million to fund England's wars fought abroad with Indian troops. Whether in Afghanistan, Burma, or France, the expansion and defense of the British Empire were financed by Indian blood and Indian taxes. The British exploited India's public finances through various means. One notable method was the establishment of the world's most expensive civil service. Indians were relegated and restricted to only the lowest-ranking governmental positions, with only 4% of top positions filled by Indians, leaving the most prestigious and best-paying posts for the British. A job as an imperial civil servant was well sought after in Britain. Work was generously compensated, and civil servants exerted real political power. A 24-year-old district officer could be in charge of millions of people. The ideal candidate was envisioned as a quintessential British gentleman with a strong background in classical literature. Lord Mayo, who served as the Governor-General of India, personified this ideal, declaring, "We are British gentlemen engaged in the magnificent work of governing an inferior race." Indian civil servicemen earned the highest salaries and pensions in the world. Unsurprisingly, significant salary disparities existed, with 8,000 British officials earning nearly £14 million annually, in stark contrast to the 130,000 Indian counterparts who received just £3 million. After just 20 years of service, British officials were entitled to generous pensions, with around 7,500 Englishmen receiving £20 million annually, all funded by the Indian taxpayer, who starved themselves to feed the growing British appetite for revenue. These pensions were of course all spent in England, where British civil servants returned, thus further stimulating the British economy. The world's most lucrative corporate ladder was created in India, but only the British could climb it. For centuries, the handloom weavers of India produced some of the world's most exquisite fabrics, exporting to Egypt, Turkey, and Persia. During the era when the British were primarily traders, Indian textiles and silk production saw a surge of up to 33%. The industry flourished, becoming more productive and innovative, with gold flowing from Europe to India in exchange for these goods. However, as British dominance in India solidified, this trade balance was reversed at gunpoint. After seizing control of the Indian textile industry, they monopolized the market by becoming the sole purchasers, effectively cutting off other export buyers. They then stopped purchasing textiles and silk with pounds, choosing to use the revenue collected from India instead. This maneuver meant that India's own revenue was employed to acquire its textiles, which were subsequently exported by the East India Company, who kept all the foreign exchange earnings. This approach eventually failed to satisfy the British appetite. In a drastic shift from exporting Indian textiles, they decimated the local industry, compelling India to import lower quality, more expensive textiles from Britain. British soldiers were dispatched to destroy Indian looms, and according to various accounts, they even resorted to crippling weavers by breaking their thumbs to ensure they could no longer work. Tariffs of 80% were imposed on Indian textile exports to the UK, rendering these exports non-viable, while British textiles entered India tariff-free. India was relegated to a mere exporter of raw materials like cotton and metal ore, enabling the British to sell finished products back to Indians at a significant markup, as well as exporting all over the world. India starved and bled so Britain could prosper. Before the East India Company's dominance, India boasted a flourishing shipbuilding industry. The Bengal trading fleet, comprising of 5,000 ships built by native artisans, were noted for its excellence. According to a British maritime observer, Indian vessels combined elegance with utility and stood as models of fine workmanship. However, the British soon enacted the Navigation Act, which stipulated that all goods imported into British colonies must be carried on British ships crewed by British nationals. This legislation dramatically boosted the demand for British maritime services, leading to the decline and eventual demise of Bengal's once vibrant shipping industry. Additionally, despite India's pioneering role in steel production and its reputation for crafting superior quality steel goods, the British took measures to dismantle and obstruct the Indian steel industry. Jamsetji Tata endeavored to establish an Indian steel factory, securing funds from Indian investors. However, the British thwarted his efforts by erecting numerous barriers for Tata. The primary consumers of steel, the government and the railways, both under British control, required steel that conformed to the British standard specification. This effectively barred Indian-made steel from its own domestic markets. Furthermore, while steel produced in India faced restrictions on exports to Britain, British steel was imported into India without tariffs. The construction of railways is often cited by some as a justification for British colonization, arguing that it brought much-needed infrastructure to India. However, again we see that this was just another scheme to enrich the British at the expense of India. British investors reaped substantial profits from the railways, buoyed by a government guarantee of a 5% return, which diminished the need for economic efficiency. When revenues fell short of covering these returns, Indian taxpayers were burdened with the losses. The cost per mile of railway in India was £18,000, compared to just £2,000 in the US. Railway shares yielded twice the return of British government bonds, becoming a significant component of British portfolio investment. Additionally, the British supplied all the equipment, from the steel for the rails to overpriced rail engines and wagons, benefiting British industry at the expense of India. The overpriced railways, constructed with Indian tax revenue and often praised by British colonial sympathizers, were also used to export vast quantities of India's grain and other agricultural products, even during times of famine. Thus, the Indian industry was not allowed to flourish due to systematic destruction by tariffs, regulatory measures, and at times, pure violence. Locked out of the corridors of power in their own country, there was little Indians could do. India by no means missed the bus to industrialization. Rather, it was the British who threw them under the bus. The subjugation of India was aptly summarized by the British Home Secretary in 1928, Sir William Hicks, who stated, "We conquered India by the sword, and by the sword we shall hold it." By the end of the 19th century, India had become Britain's biggest source of revenue, the largest purchaser of British exports, and a source of high-paid employment for British civil servants. Throughout this period, Indian soldiers fought wars to expand the very empire that enslaved them, and they did so at their own expense. Never in human history has such devastation occurred at the cost of those being devastated. A recent paper estimated between 1765 and 1947, approximately £10 trillion was drained from India. But the numbers tell only part of the story. Famine, disease, and poverty ravaged India. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands threw their wives into ponds to avoid the torment of watching them perish from hunger. India transitioned from a leading global economy to a nation completely subservient to a small island on the other side of the world. If you're interested in learning more, check out the links in the description. I have been your host, Albert. Until next time.